All right, so there are a number of great questions that came in, and what we've tried to do is sort of synthesize some of those questions and make something that's going to be common for this group. And one of the questions that came up was about infectiousness, and what does it mean to be infected with a parasite versus being infectious? I think this is particularly relevant given a lot of the discussions about the Ebola outbreak right now, with people being sick and infected with the virus for a period of time, and then only afterwards transitioning into a period of infectiousness where they can actually transmit the virus to someone else. So can someone pick that up and give us a really clear definition of what it means to be infectious versus infected?
I think I'll start with this. You might think of it as infected being a selfish process. This is something that goes on in you. You have acquired an organism, it's replicating in you, and that may be as far as it ever goes. Okay? If you're infectious, you're being very generous because you're giving the opportunity for that agent to be transmitted to someone else. So the real distinction here is in the process of an organism moving from one individual to another. That would be infectious versus infected, which is just the process of an individual being a host to a parasitic organism.
So while we talk about an infectious period, in some diseases like measles that you guys work on, that's a fairly fixed period for the disease in most people, but it does vary, doesn't it, enormously from individuals to individuals. But I also wanted to mention that there are some diseases where there's a latent period. So for example, with tuberculosis, you could become infected, but the bacteria sit in your lungs for a period of time before they might break out and make you infectious. And you can be infected, but not infectious for many, many years.
And permanently, actually.
Yeah.
It was particularly with tuberculosis, because a third of the world's population is infected with Mycobacterium tuberculosis. But very few people are actually transmitting that to someone else.
And I think that's, when we think about infectious disease dynamics, then it's interesting to recognize that when we think about the dynamics, then we typically think about the latent period, which is the period between being infected and becoming infectious, and the infectious period, which is different from if we think about the more medical point of view, where we talk about the incubation period, which is the period between being infected and starting to start showing symptoms of disease. Mm-hmm. And it is very important, like Mary and Pete said, that those two things, so the incubation period and the latent period, might be similar, or it might be very different. And also the infectious period can also be very, very different from the period when you show symptoms of the disease. So for example, if in whooping cough, typically you'll, which used to be called the 100-day cough in Chinese, the disease will progress for much longer time than you're actually infectious. So you might be infectious maybe for 10 days or 2 weeks, but your cough can persist for 4 weeks or 6 weeks. And from a dynamics point of view, it's very important to keep that distinction in mind, I think.
But you bring up an interesting question that I'd love actually to have answered, which is usually when we have symptoms is when we have the trigger cue to engage in behavior, right? We're not necessarily great at washing our hands all the time or making sure that we've actually coughed into something that we then dispose, but as soon as we have a symptom or somebody else is symptomatic, then we engage. But the symptom infectiousness overlap, right? So a lot of the discussion right now is only once a person's symptomatic, could they be infectious? Is that what's going on with Ebola? But that's not always true, is it?
No,
Not true
at all.
So
Which is why you should always wash your hands.
So there are some diseases where people can become asymptomatic transmitters, and they can not show any symptoms for long periods of time. Of course, Mary Malone and typhus was the very famous example. But there's many diseases which take place, and of course, even with HIV, you can be totally asymptomatic during the whole period you're being infectious.